In the previous lecture, we looked at text classification as a workflow decision. You define labels, you choose or train a model, and then you evaluate whether the predictions are useful enough for the decision you want to make. A useful way to think about pre-trained pipelines is that they give you a much faster starting point. Suppose you have a few hundred customer messages and you want to know whether they are mostly positive or negative, or which companies and places are mentioned. You could build everything yourself. You could tokenize the text, load a model, run inference, decode the output, and format the result. That is a reasonable engineering path, but it is a lot of machinery just to test whether the idea is useful. Without a pipeline, the workflow has many moving parts. Text has to be split into tokens. Tokens become numeric input. The model produces scores. The scores are decoded into labels. Finally, the output has to be formatted so a human or another program can use it. Each of these steps matters, and later in the course we will keep coming back to them. But when you are exploring a task, you may not want to build the whole stack first. The pipeline interface compresses this stack into a task-level call. In Python, for example, you can create a sentiment analysis pipeline and pass in a sentence. The result might come back as a label and a score. That does not mean the model is perfect. It means you now have a fast baseline. You can run examples, inspect behavior, and decide whether the task is worth deeper work. This is why pipelines are so useful in learning and prototyping. They lower the cost of asking practical questions. Does sentiment analysis work on our kind of reviews? Does named entity recognition find the organizations and locations we care about? Does the model fail in a predictable way, or does it fail in ways that would be hard to manage? There is also a learning benefit. When the pipeline returns an output immediately, you can focus on interpreting behavior instead of spending the whole session on setup. You can compare 5 examples, change one word, and see what changes. That makes the model less mysterious. You are not just reading about NLP, you are testing a system and building intuition from what it does. But this convenience has a cost. A pipeline can hide important assumptions. It hides what data the model learned from. It hides what labels the model was trained to produce. It hides whether the model was evaluated on examples that look like your examples. If we only look at the polished output, it is easy to forget that there is still a model inside, and that model has limits. So the practical rule is simple. Use pre-trained pipelines to learn quickly, but do not treat them as final truth. First, run the pipeline, then inspect the output, then stress test it with examples that look like your real use case. A pipeline is a very good starting point, but the system becomes useful only after you test what kind of signal it can reliably provide. The next question is not only, can we run a pre-trained model? The better question is this model suitable for the problem we are trying to solve? It is tempting to choose the first model that works. You call the pipeline, you see a label, and the output looks professional. But model choice is part of the design of the system. A model is not just a file you download. It carries assumptions about the task, the language, the label space, the training data, and the evaluation setting. A model card is like a nutrition label for a pre-trained model. It tells you what the model was built for, what data it was trained or fine-tuned on, what labels it predicts, which languages or domains it is meant for, and often what limitations are known. You do not need to memorize every field, but you should build the habit of checking the basics before you trust the output. This habit is especially useful because pre-trained models can feel more objective than they are. The interface is clean, the score is numeric, and the library call looks the same for many tasks. But the model card reminds us that this is still an artifact made from choices: which data was included, which labels were used, which examples were considered success, and which limitations were documented by the creators. The task name is not enough. 2 models may both say they perform sentiment analysis, but one model may have 2 labels, positive and negative, while another may include neutral. A model trained for short movie review sentiment may behave differently from a model you use on airline complaints, product tickets, or university feedback. The output format may look similar, but the meaning of the label can be different. Training data also matters. If a model has mostly learned from one kind of text, it may become very good at that style and weaker somewhere else. This is not a reason to avoid pre-trained models. It is a reason to use them with a little discipline. We should ask, what does this model know well? What might it not know well? And how close are my inputs to the examples it was evaluated on? Domain fit is the practical question. A general model may be perfectly good for exploration, especially when the task is low risk. If you are just trying to understand a data set, a general pipeline can help you move quickly. But if the prediction will trigger a customer workflow, route a complaint, or support a business decision, then the bar is higher. You may need domain examples, manual checks, or a more specialized model. Before trusting the output, read the assumptions before reading the scores. The score may look precise, but the score is only meaningful inside the model's learned world. If the model's label space, language, and training context match your problem reasonably well, the score becomes more useful. If they do not match, the score can still be high and still be misleading. The main takeaway for this block is that availability is not suitability. A model that runs is only the beginning. A model that fits the task, the data, and the decision is what we actually need. Now let us compare two common pipeline tasks, sentiment analysis and named entity recognition. They are often introduced together because both can be run with a pre-trained pipeline, but they answer different questions and they produce different kinds of signal. Sentiment analysis looks at the whole text, or at least at a full sentence or document, and assigns an attitude to it. The output is usually a label and a score. For example, a review might come back as negative with a score of 0.94. This is useful when the question is, what is the overall tone of this text? Is the customer satisfied? Is the message positive, negative, or neutral? Named entity recognition is different. NER does not ask for the tone of the whole message. It looks for spans of text that refer to things such as people, organizations, locations, products, or dates. If a sentence says, "The Skyways app failed in Munich," sentiment analysis might say the tone is negative. Named entity recognition might extract Skyways as an organization or product and Munich as a location. The output shape changes the workflow. Sentiment gives you a document-level label. You might store it as a column, filter by it, aggregate it, or use it to prioritize review. NER gives you structured pieces of text. You might use those entities as search facets, database fields, tags, or links to other records. Both tasks use text as input, but the downstream action is different. Here is a small example. Suppose a customer writes, "I like the cabin crew, but the Skyways app failed again in Munich." If we only run sentiment analysis, we may get a mixed or negative label. That tells us something about the emotional tone, but it does not tell us what the complaint is about. If we also run named entity recognition, we can identify Skyways app and Munich as the things the feedback points to. When you combine them, the signal becomes richer. Sentiment tells you whether the tone is positive or negative. NER tells you what the tone is about. In a product setting, this can be much more useful than either output alone. You can ask which products are mentioned in negative feedback, which locations are associated with service complaints, which organizations appear in customer conversations. This is also a good place to notice that pre-trained NLP is not one single capability. It is a family of task interfaces. Some tasks compress a text into a label. Some tasks extract pieces. Some generate new text. Some compare two texts. The pipeline abstraction makes these tasks feel similar to call, but the outputs should be interpreted differently. There are also different failure modes. A sentiment model may struggle with sarcasm, politeness, or mixed sentiment. "The staff was kind, but the refund process was impossible" contains a positive phrase and a serious negative issue. A named entity model may split words into fragments, miss domain-specific names, or confuse a product name with an organization. These errors are not the same, so we should not evaluate them in the same way. The practical distinction is simple. Sentiment analysis classifies the text. Named entity recognition structures parts of the text. If your use case needs a quick view of tone, sentiment may be the first signal. If your use case needs to know who, what, where, or when, NER may be the first signal. And if you need actionable analytics, you often want both. So when you choose a pre-trained pipeline, do not only ask what task sounds impressive, ask what shape of output your workflow needs. A whole message label and a list of extracted spans can both be valuable, but they support different decisions. The number on the output can be misleading if we read it too quickly. A model might return a label with a confidence score of 0.98. That looks strong, but confidence is not the same as reliability. One useful way to think about the score is this. The model is telling you how confident it is under its own learned assumptions. It is not telling you that the prediction is definitely correct for your use case. If the model learned the wrong patterns for your domain, it can be confidently wrong. If your text contains sarcasm, unusual product names, mixed languages, or domain-specific phrasing, the score may still look clean while the interpretation is weak. A better habit is to test controlled pairs. Take one sentence, change one element, and see whether the model changes in a reasonable way. For sentiment, you might compare, "The hotel was clean and the staff was helpful," with, "The hotel was clean, but the refund process was impossible." The second sentence is not simply negative in every word, but the business problem is serious. You want to know whether the model reacts to the part that matters. Controlled pairs are useful because they make debugging visible. If you change 5 things at once, you may not know what caused the model to change. If you change one phrase, one name, one location, or one product term, you learn more. This is the same mindset as a small experiment in data analysis. Isolate the variable, observe the result, and decide whether the behavior makes sense. Bias tests are not a separate ethics exercise that happens only at the end. They belong in normal quality assurance. You can vary names, places, dialects, occupations, or product categories and check whether the model changes for reasons that make sense. Sometimes a model is using real context. Sometimes it may be carrying patterns from training data that are not appropriate for your workflow. NER has its own failure modes. A span model may split an entity into pieces. It may treat OpenAI differently from OpenAI. It may label a product as an organization or miss a local brand that is important to your business. If you use the entities for search, analytics, or routing, these small extraction errors can create downstream problems. Some errors are acceptable and some are costly. If you are exploring a dataset, a noisy prediction may still be useful because it helps you see patterns quickly. If the output automatically triggers an email to a customer, blocks a transaction, routes a complaint, or appears in a management dashboard, the same error may be much more serious. Reliability is not only a property of the model, it is also a property of the decision attached to the model. The workflow is not just run the model and believe the score. A stronger workflow is sample realistic examples, run the pipeline, inspect successes and failures, add edge cases, and decide whether the model is good enough for this use. If it is not good enough, you might adjust the threshold, choose another model, add human review, collect labeled examples, or move toward fine-tuning later in the course. The practical rule is that trust grows from tests, not from confidence. A high score can be useful, but only when it is supported by evidence from examples that look like your real data. That is why pipeline work is still engineering work. The pipeline gives you a fast start. Your tests tell you whether the start is reliable enough to continue. A notebook prediction is not yet an application. It is easy to stop when the cell prints a label and a score, but in a real workflow, the important question is what happens next. Suppose we analyze airline reviews. The raw text is messy. One review complains about delays, another mentions friendly staff, another talks about an app problem in a specific airport. If we run a sentiment pipeline, we can create a new column such as sentiment label. If we also keep the score, we may create sentiment score. If we run NER, we may add extracted organizations, locations, or product names. Now the prediction is no longer just a printout. It is becoming data. Predictions become useful as table columns because we can compare, aggregate, and filter them. We might count negative reviews by route. We might look for product names that appear often in complaints. We might compare high-confidence negative messages with lower-confidence messages that need review. At this point, the pre-trained pipeline is not the product. It is one part of a larger analytical workflow. Once it is a column, aggregation turns outputs into patterns. A single negative label is not very informative by itself, but if negative labels cluster around one route, one product feature, or one time period, then the signal may guide investigation. This is where NLP becomes useful for managers, analysts, and product teams. It turns a pile of text into a view that can be discussed. This also gives you a way to check the model at a higher level. If the chart says 90% of reviews are positive, but you know the dataset came from a complaint form, that should make you pause. Aggregation is not only for presentation, it is also a sanity check. The pattern should make sense relative to how the data was collected. A threshold is a product decision. If you say, only messages above 0.9 confidence go into an automatic negative review queue, that threshold is not just a technical number. It decides which messages receive attention and which do not. A lower threshold may catch more problems but create more noise. A higher threshold may reduce noise but miss important cases. The right threshold depends on the cost of mistakes. Some predictions should go to humans. This is especially true when the model is uncertain, when the action is expensive, or when the content affects people directly. A good workflow may automatically tag easy cases and send uncertain cases to review. This is not a weakness, it is often the responsible design. Document 3 things whenever you use a pre-trained pipeline. First, what input the model sees. Second, what output it produces. Third, how that output is used. If you cannot answer the third question, you do not yet have an application, you have a model call. If you remember one thing from this lecture, remember this sequence: fast baseline, tested signal, clear use. Pre-trained pipelines are valuable because they help you move quickly from raw text to structured output. They become reliable only when you inspect assumptions and test examples, and they become useful only when the output supports a real decision, dashboard, or workflow.